So we're gonna take this kind of like a college course. In college classes, you interact a lot, you jump in, you say things, you ask questions. I like asking questions while I have the thought in my head instead of saving it for the end because I always forget. So if you have a question, jump in. But this is gonna be a little bit more of like a conversation because that's how you learn the best, you know what I mean? So we're going to talk about some topics in the international system, and you can hit the space bar. I'm assuming you guys probably know that it's going to be mostly about governments, economics, geography, culture, and human rights. So why I'm here is because, you know, I'm from Cape Girardeau. I grew up here. I actually went to CCS, which is like another smaller school. And then I went to Central for high school, had so much fun. I actually know John from high school, which is great. And then I went to the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville for college. Went being really interested in so many things, but not exactly having a total idea of what I wanted to do. Which I was really encouraged to not have some super, specific path and explore lots of other things. So I started studying international studies, which is kind of aligned with this topic. I ended up specializing in peace, security, and human rights. So with that, I studied what was going on in the Middle East. I became more interested in that. And for that major, you had to study a language. And I had done a little bit of Spanish. Like, have y'all ever studied like a little bit of Spanish like when you were younger? And then when I was in high school, I took like a French class and just like had so much fun with my friends, being like oui, oui all the time and stuff like that. And so when I was in college, I decided I'm gonna try Arabic. Like, when else in life will I have the chance to learn this? Like, that's kind of interesting. Also, Arabic is the second most widest spoken language in the entire world. It's it's the main predominant language in 22 different countries. And so I love making friends. I'm a really social butterfly. So I was like, might as well know something where you can meet so many more people and, go to travel so many more countries and see all the different ways of life there. So then I really loved it. It was super, super challenging. And, you write backwards from how we write. You read backwards. And I just loved that challenge. So I decided to major in it. And then COVID hit. So I couldn't get a job. And one of my advisors encouraged me to look at grad school. So I applied to grad school. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what grad school was before I showed up. I literally applied the day applications were due because I thought for a really long time, I was like, I just am not I'm not that kind of person. Like, I like people. I don't love school. I like learning, but I don't know. Grad school seems really intimidating. And I was so wrong because grad school is the best. I mean, I enjoyed school growing up, but grad school is where I found out that I have this huge passion and interest in something, and I get to study it all the time and then try to find a job regarding that. So that is why I'm here to talk to you today, because it's kind of led me on this path of human rights and things like that. So last thing I'll say is my area of expertise that I kind of found, by no means am I an expert, but something that I'm really interested in, is counterterrorism. So I study women in terrorism specifically, not something a lot of people talk about. I look at rehabilitation programs for former female terrorists, and I specifically look at ISIS. So they're a group that's based in Syria predominantly. And that led me to the reason I'm back in Cape right now is I just finished up an internship. Have y'all heard of the United Nations before? Yeah. Okay, slide. So the UN is this big international body, and the secretariat is in New York City. So I just finished an internship at the UN Office of Counterterrorism, and it was really great. It was a huge learning experience. And I was on the Victims of Terrorism team. So my team was mandated to work globally with all victims of terrorism and counterterrorism. So we worked with people from things like 9/11, if they had lost a family member in 9/11, or some of the terrorist attacks that happened in the 90s in Ireland, some of the ones in Spain, a lot in Iraq and in Syria, and other places. So it was a really interesting experience, and I think made me more grateful to have that side of it too. Yeah.
So ISIS is for or against the United Nations?
So ISIS is against the United Nations, but, and we can definitely talk a little bit more about that afterwards too, because it's super interesting to me, but it is a radical terrorist group that tried to establish what they call caliphate, which is basically a state. So they wanted their own country, and then they failed to do so. But one of the things that's interesting is ISIS recruited people from more than 60 countries across the world. And so people all went into Syria, and now they're kind of stuck there because the country didn't work out. And so if you ever look at Al-Hol, that's a big thing that my office worked on, and things like that. But yeah, ISIS is not necessarily for world peace. They're for world domination. So if you want to click to the next slide, we'll kind of get into some of that.
Could you say your name again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, Peyton.
Oh.
Yep. So yeah, so I just kind of wanted to see, like, what have y'all like learned so far? I know you said you know a little bit about the UN, but like, have you talked much about anything else? And you can throw out anything.
Well, I think most of my previous knowledge is from different years or just my own studies.
Cool.
So,
Okay, cool. So kind of just like you're interested and you know a little bit about what you know. Okay, you can go to the next one. Next question. Are there any like facts or topics or things in the news that you found really interesting that you're like, oh, I'd like to know more about that? Anything like that? For me, that was counterterrorism. You know, it wasn't necessarily like really widely talked about, but for you it might be refugees. You know, it might be some of the, yeah.
So did you work closely, I'm not sure, were you still working on your internship when the war in Israel started?
Mm-hmm.
So did you ever have stuff from people coming over to work about that?
Yeah, it was definitely something that did come up, and I was telling your teacher, I was actually supposed to be doing an internship in Israel. I was there last year, and one of the things that was interesting about the UN is that they don't take sides, really. They have spoken very much so about the humanitarian atrocities that are happening and trying to protect civilians, which we'll get into. But the UN tries to stay out of things because they're just there for the people, which is interesting. Okay, last one. And we can maybe even skip this one, but I just want to know if there's anything really specific you want to make sure we cover when it talks about human rights and stuff like that. Or, you know, if we're just going to jump into the topic, we can figure that out later.
I already asked the question about like the news, like how do you find your information? But I think that'd be something cool to cover too.
Totally. I have a book list at the end that I recommend, and we can also talk about news and stuff like that. How do you keep up with this and not be terrified daily that like the world's on fire, because that's what it seems like a lot of times.
Maybe too, just like what is important for them to know, because there are so many like things being fed to them. Like
totally.
It's important to even have an understanding of.
Totally.
Is it? Do I need to know all this?
Yes. Yes, definitely. Okay, cool. You can go to the next one. So this is kind of our agenda for how this course or lecture today is going to go. So we're going to do like an inverted pyramid. So we're going to start really broad. So human rights goes across all countries, every continent, everyone that's a human. So it's this massive umbrella that covers you and everybody over in Africa and some of the people up in the Arctic, all that kind of stuff. And then that dictates what happens at the United Nations. The United Nations is the governing body that ensures those. So that's kind of another bigger piece. And then where we're going to get smaller is governments. Governments control what's in their territory, what's in their land, what's in their constitution, but they also have to abide by human rights. So if you think about it, all of this stuff keeps covering as you go down. Human rights are, governments have to respect human rights. And then governments control their economies. They pick and choose what trade they want to do and things like that. And then we'll do a case study where we'll talk a little bit more about geography and culture, and that's going to be specifically about Ethiopia, which is actually where Felix and Fisher are adopted from. You can go to the next one. You can hit one more. Okay, so Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Does anybody know what this is, or have you heard about this before? No, that's okay. Does anybody know, like, I have the definition up here, but in your mind, like, when you think about a right, like, what is an example of a right, or how would you define that? Like, my mom, when I was talking to her about this, she's like, oh, yeah, like a right to clean water. What's, like, another right? Yeah.
Like our amendments and our freedom of speech or freedom.
Right. Yeah, those are rights that Americans have that we ensure, like, in this country. That's a great example of a right. Anybody else have a thought? That's okay. So one definition of a right is a condition of living without which man or woman cannot give the best of themselves as active members of the community because they are deprived of the means to fulfill themselves as human beings. So basically a right is being able to be the fullest version of yourself, being able to have education, clean water, work or not work, married or don't get married, participate in a religion or don't participate in a religion. It's the essence of kind of like human beings, how we're different from other species here on Earth, and that we get to be the fullest version of that. So, second question, in your mind, if that's what a right is, getting to be the fullest, what is a human right? Any thoughts? Yeah. Yeah, food, water, shelter. Yeah, air, yeah.
Like if there's like some sort of like war situation, not to brutalize whoever, like if you take captives of war,
Totally.
something like that, like you shouldn't brutalize them. Kind of like when we learned in history a while back, some of the kings and queens really weren't great.
Yes.
Thankfully, we now have human rights where they can't do what they did, enslaving people, hurting them, and trying to get information out. We have actually a
Totally. Yeah, that's a great example, actually. It's a really good one. Yeah, so if you click one more button, human rights, you're good. If you can just click, no, you're so fine. So human rights are rights that are inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other little thing that makes you you. Human rights include the right to life and liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, exactly like you said, freedom of opinion and expression, you know, your political views, your personal views, the right to work and education, exactly like someone else said, and so many more things. And every single person is entitled to these rights without discrimination. So next we're going to talk a little bit about the UNDHR, which is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN Charter. I'm going to hop on my phone because I have a couple of notes that I wrote, that I made. So you can go to the next slide. And also, that's the UN logo. I don't know if you've seen that before, but that's kind of their logo. Okay, maybe...
It's like taking time because I went back to the picture.
Oh, that's okay, sorry. So one of the things is the UNDHR. So this is Eleanor Roosevelt. She was a former First Lady. She was one of 4 women who helped write the Universal Declaration of Independence, of Human Rights. And that's what she's holding in her hand. So some of the questions of like, well, why did we need this? You know, like, why wasn't everybody playing nicely in the sandbox? And one of the things is, does anyone know how long we've had human rights? Fun fact, we just celebrated the 75th anniversary or birthday of human rights. My birthday is December 10th, and it was enacted, signed on December 10th, 1948. So I pulled this from a web. I know. My mom was like, we foresaw that, and I was like, oh, totally. So why did we need this document? I'm going to read this. This is an excerpt. It says, less than 3 decades after the First World War, in which more than 18 million soldiers and civilians were killed, Europe was once again embroiled in a major conflict. Then the Second World War, which pitted Germany, Japan, and Italy against Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, engulfed the world in a firestorm of death and destruction far exceeding that of the Great War from 1914 to 1918. So this was not only a global war, but it was a total war in which each nation's entire human and material resources were called into service. So you know how like we a lot of times in the U.S. talk about women entered the workforce during the great World War II and things like that. And some of these factories we had all of a sudden started switching from making watches to bullets and stuff. So about 70 million civilians and soldiers were killed, making World War II the deadliest conflict in human history. Millions were left homeless, and millions more began an uncertain life as refugees. So, in the context of the world, Europe is destroyed. So many towns, communities, there's no, people don't have homes to go back to. All of and it's not just in Europe. If you think about it, there was an atomic bomb dropped in Japan. We had firebombed Japan. There were now refugees where people didn't have citizenship. One country, there's no longer, Hitler wasn't in control anymore. There was fascism and all this kind of stuff. The world was just crazy and there was no order. But everybody was agreed, we cannot go back to what was happening. So Eleanor Roosevelt, this fabulous woman we have here, she said one time that you can measure the extent of physical damage that's done in a crisis, like to cities and things like that, but how to gauge what has happened to human beings is incalculable. So there was this economic impact and there was an infrastructure impact, but we as people needed to do better to guard just mankind. So representatives from 50 different countries, they all gathered in San Francisco, of all places, and they had this big conference, and they're like, basically, all right, we're going to spitball some ideas for how we're going to build this United Nations. So they talked for 2 months. They wrote the UN Charter, signed it, and then 3 years later, so that was in 1945, for 3 years, Eleanor Roosevelt and 50 other people, there were only 4 women of the 50, they helped write the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So one of the things that they really had to think about is the UN's not a government, right? Like, we have to obey the laws of our government because we're American citizens, and because we live here. We have to obey the laws of Missouri because we live in Missouri. Nobody lives in the United Nations. It's not really a government. So how is this going to work, And they had to think about that. And how do they make it broad enough to cover every culture and language and religion and all these things of all these people around the world? You can go to the next one. Back one more. So this is the preamble. we're gonna briefly talk through it, but kind of like what's most important is in yellow. And this is where she and the others addressed universality and things like that. So it says, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity, that wording's like really specific, inherent dignity, and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. So regardless of what you look like, where you're from, what language you speak, if you're human, you're part of that. The foundation of freedom, justice, and is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Whereas disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the consciousness of mankind and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom and something else, and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of common people. Because everyone was like, we cannot have this destruction happen again. Whereas it is essential if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and
Oppression.
Something like that, yeah. Oh, oppression. That human rights should be protected by the rule of the law. Whereas it is essential to promote the development of friendly relations between nations. So remember, we were just at war with everybody. All of a sudden, we gotta come play friendly in the sandbox, And whereas the peoples of the United Nations have the Charter, the UN Charter, reaffirmed their faith in fundamental rights in the integrity and worth of the human person and in the equal rights of men and women. That was something that Eleanor Roosevelt personally added. And so you can kind of see, like it says here, every individual and every organ of society, achievement of all peoples and all nations. So they want to make sure not a single person was left out, and it covered everybody. Universal and effective recognition and observance. Nobody could get out of this. This is everybody agreeing to it. You can go to the next one. So in this document, there's 30 articles that make up the 30 human rights. So I know you can't see number 5, but that one is on torture, actually, which is really interesting. So we're all born with free and equal rights. We have the right to be free from discrimination, you know. We have the right to be free from slavery. Again, this is post-World War II, but not necessarily a post-colonial world. There's still a lot of colonies across Africa, and we'll talk about Ethiopia later. We have the right to be equal protection under the law, seek justice. You have, I thought this one was really fun, 24, you have the right to rest. Isn't that like so nice? You know? Like that's kind of great. You have the right to rest and play. Gather peacefully, you know. You have the right to marriage, but not child marriage. You don't have to be forced into one.
This is part of what the UN. Okay.
Yes, so these are all things that guide the principles and actions and projects and programs today that the UN works on. You can go to the next one. So that's kind of the UN. Was there any questions about that? Any other like follow-ups you guys wanted, topics hit on that one? How are we doing on time? Okay. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
How does the UN interact with organizations and countries that don't agree to that?
Yeah, great question.
Like
one of the things.
Countries that weren't around or something like that.
Yeah, so I believe the UN now has 193. Someone can totally fact check me on that. I think there's 193 participants in the UN. And, you know, it's really interesting when you talk about like the Security Council because the Security Council has veto power. That's a conversation for another day. But, you know, the UN, for example, right now, there's the war between Israel and Palestine, right? And that's a really big conflict. That's like, ooh, really scary. Oh my gosh, I don't know exactly what's happening. But there is a representative from Palestine actually at the UN. And I, last year, got to have dinner with someone who is the former Prime Minister of Palestine, who's like the greatest person I've ever met. And he loves football, funny enough. He got his PhD at UT. But yeah, so there's like the EU, the European Union, which is this like really big kind of organization that oversees a lot of Europe. There's the African Union. There's also, you know, like I believe Afghanistan was supposed to be on the Human Rights Council. And everyone was like, can't really do that because, you know, you don't let girls go to school and you guys don't really follow human rights. So there's definitely times when it's really complicated. But, you know, not everybody, the way the UN works is it's not forcing everyone to do everything because without buy-in, it's not going to actually happen. So everyone has to choose, and that's why things move really slowly there because you've got to have everybody's input and adjustment, and that's how it works. But there's definitely, I mean, I think there's definitely times when people butt heads at the UN and things don't work. But for the most part, that's where everybody's welcome, so you got to all play nice, you know? Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the role of government. So, does anybody know what apophysis is? I didn't know until like a year ago, and I thought it was such a cool word. It's basically defining something by what it's not. So, we're going to do like a little thought exercise. Let's say you're not in Missouri right now, and you're not going to Prodigy, you're not an American citizen, but what year were like some of y'all born?
2007.
Okay, so let's say in 2007 or in 2009, you were born somewhere else. Let's say somewhere in the Middle East. Let's even say Syria, okay? And currently, how old are you guys? 16, 17. It's like some of you are interested in driving. Maybe you're looking at potential careers, things like that. If you had been born back then in Syria, you may or may not have citizenship, which means you may or may not have papers saying what day you were born, and to whom your parents are, who you belong, who your guardian is. That means you probably wouldn't have grown up in a country like this where not only are there things like free education, you know, you would be trying to find your own, and most likely your parents probably wouldn't be able to afford it because they probably wouldn't be able to work. And you'd be stuck in a war, and you might not have access to electricity really, so think about how that like changes what you're making for dinner every night or how you're learning, There's not going to be public libraries, so you can't go to a library and read a book if that's what you wanted to do. You probably won't get mail or stay in touch with your relatives. And when it comes to things like trash, that's something we really take for granted because you just put the bin out and it gets picked up. That doesn't happen in places where there's, you're not a part of a country and there's not a stable government and things like that. Your water, you may or may not have clean water. If you have access to water, you might have to wait in line. And for all the girls in this classroom, you might be the ones, depending on where you're at, going to get that water. And if you have food, it's probably not from a grocery store. It might be a bag of rice that was donated. So you know what I'm saying? If you're thinking about, I think when you think about what does government do, there's so many things that we forget about, what it actually does. Especially right now in the US, politics are this crazy thing where people are butting heads all the time. But it makes us miss the point of all the things that we actually have. So it's protections. We have protections here. If you want to get together, if you want to vote, you have that right. If you want to, vote a certain way for a certain candidate, if you want to have an education, all of these types of things. Accountability. Governments have accountability. Here, we have a bicameral system. We've also got local governments. Does anyone know our mayor? Stacy Kinder. Yeah, that's so fun. And then you've got state government, which would be, ours is Missouri. And then you've got federal government, which is all the people at the top, So there's lots of checks and balances built into our system that we have here. We are a democracy, which is great. Other countries are not. We have rights and you have freedoms. And so when you think about what is government, I think, you know what I mean when I say it's better to think about by what it's not? So there's 10 million stateless people, which means they, in the world today. But also, statelessness, if you think about it, has been around as long as states have established. Why was it used? It's not just rulers and kings and queens or conquerors, people, marching in and fighting and taking over other territories. But what was the purpose of that? Why did they want to be in control? A lot of that came down to trade, came down to assets, products, land, where that land is, the value of that land, if it's by the sea, which gives you a port. One of the things that governments do, and when they do it well, the citizens benefit, is relations with other nations. So the US has a lot of friends. We're really friendly. We get along well with a lot of people. There's a lot of people we don't get along well. But because of that, we benefit with them from trade and different agreements, Security, that's something that I study. Our government works to ensure our security and safety. So whether that's the local level, the police, you've got police around making sure people aren't flying through the streets at 90 miles an hour, stopping at stoplights. That's the security that impacts you daily here. But there's a bigger picture of security that also impacts you daily, which is going back to those relations. Canada, they could decide all of a sudden, even though they're friendly Canada, they don't really do much, they could decide to come take us over. But we have really good relations with them, so that's not going to happen. And even if they did, we have a Navy, we have an Army, we have an Air Force, we have border security. There's more than 17 different national security apparatuses. Have any of you ever flown in an airplane? Yeah? Okay, when you go to the airport, you have to go through security, and you have to go show your passport, your papers. And even when you go to other states, it's different for us because we're going most of the time between states. But if you think about Europe, kind of countries there, the size of states. So you're going in between countries. So they are always in charge of you. And what's really cool about being a US citizen is that when you go overseas, the US government still has its eye on you. So if anything happens to you, they will come swoop you out if you need rescuing, or they will make sure that there's representatives. The US embassies are all over the world in every single country. I think even the Vatican, I'm pretty sure, which is kind of funny. And so if you get arrested, or if you get in an accident, or if you need help, or if there's conflict breaks out, the US government immediately has your back and they're going to come save you. political systems, like we had talked about, and then all these other services. So the ones that I could think of when I was making these notes were postal. We love our post mail. Like, I love sending postcards. I send tons of postcards. The police, education. You guys go to Prodigy. A lot of people go. Have any of you ever been to like public school before? Yeah. So public school, that's, you know, set by the state. Trash, like I said, trash is local. Water. Not only do we have a lot of drinking water here in Missouri that we have to clean, but we clean all of our wastewater before it goes back into the Mississippi. Because if not, people would be dumping waste into the Mississippi. That's disgusting. It would smell awful. And with us being in the middle America, if that wasn't regulated, everybody from all the way up north and all that runoff and everything, it would smell awful here. So that's really fun. Infrastructure, because we have, you know, we're on a lot of waterways and things like that. We've got tons of bridges, but also roads. Who would build roads if the government wasn't there to set these paths? So government has so many different roles. And in America, we kind of have an idea of what that looks like, but it looks different in other places. So now we're talking about economics. Is anyone like really jazzed by economics? Feel like they're going to be like a future economist? Okay, I thought it was the most boring thing ever, and I was so wrong. And I'm not a math girly. I'm not, like, that's not my area of expertise. But economics is this way of putting a lens or this set of glasses on that helps you see the world in a totally different light. So, you know, countries specialize in economics. Economics in your economy is how your country means something to the world. It's how you make money. So, you know, if you think back about specialized products, like I always think of, or for example, because we're going to talk about Ethiopia, does anybody know what really special product Ethiopia has and what was started there? Coffee. I drink a lot of coffee. I don't know if y'all drink coffee, but whenever I was younger, someone told me that coffee stunts your growth, and I was like the tallest girl in my class always. So I started like sneaking coffee, and my parents were like, "Why is she so crazy?" But coffee, yeah, coffee's from Ethiopia, which I think is so cool. Or if you think about, you know, when I think of Italy, I think of like olive oil. That's been around for a really long time. It's not just in Italy. Sardines. Anybody like sardines? You know, not a whole lot, but like Spain. Spain used to specialize in sardines. Rice, China. You know, a long time ago, back if you look in history books, China also used to be this huge exporter of opium. If you ever look at the opium wars, it's a really interesting part of history. So this like good, they call it like a good product that you have, you can start sharing that and selling it to others and all these things. And so that was like how it started a really long time ago. But now, in this modernized world, it looks a little different. So how do you like judge whose economy is doing better than others? So a bunch of economists, yeah.
So my uncle actually mentioned something about this whenever we went to Nashville. He said that the economy of places is, you can judge the economy of somewhere based upon how many cranes they have.
Oh, interesting.
And
Yeah.
a bunch of tall cranes, typically that means the place has a better economy.
Maybe because it's growing more. It's kind of like an indicator that you can see. Yeah, so that's exactly kind of what I'm going to talk about is like there's so many different ways you can judge how an economy works. And one of those ways economists used to rate that is called GDP. When you go to college or whatever you do, if you're reading any kind of news article, you'll probably come across GDP, gross domestic product. And the really boring version of the definition is that it measures the monetary value of final goods and services, that is, those that are bought by the final user, produced in a country in a given period of time, so maybe quarterly, monthly, yearly. And it counts for all the output generated within the borders of that country. So GDP is composed of goods and services produced for sale in the market, and also includes some non-market production like defense and education. And GDP worked for a long time. This was like a pretty great standard that you could set. But we started realizing that it wasn't actually measuring anything. Not anything, everything. And one of the ways that there was a gap is we had some lady economists, some female economists that are saying that, you know, it looks like women aren't contributing to this country's economy. Maybe women just don't have as many jobs. Maybe women, it's because they didn't, have education for a really long time, and we kind of just like thought maybe that was it. But if you look at the math and how GDP is calculated, it wasn't actually factoring in the cash trade that women are doing. So, if you're in Kenya, for example, and you need to go buy some flour or some grain, there's probably going to be a woman with a stall, but her daily transactions in cash might not get registered. Or did any of you guys like babysit? Make money babysitting? Okay, I made lots of money, not lots, but that's like the main job that I had, even up through college, was babysitting. And usually they just like Venmo you or give you a little cash or whatever. That's probably not getting, registered in your macroeconomics, country, results or whatever. So women are seamstresses. They have a lot of farms. They're selling products on the side of the road. Maybe they're selling dresses, nannying, or they have an early education childhood center at their home. So it's kind of this thing where it's like, we can look at economies as a way to grade countries, and it can give us a lot of indicators of how well they're doing, like the health of a country. Because if it's making a lot of money and people have money, then they're going to spend it. They're going to have better, they're going to have money to spend on food and things like that. But it didn't cover everything. And so in the 1990s, they created something called the Human Development Index. And we can watch, this is a really short video that talks just a little bit about that. You should, if you click the, yeah. I think it's just background noise, honestly. Yeah, so basically, can you guys all read that? Okay. Okay. So it looks at things outside of just the economy alone. Life and health, knowledge, standard of living. So this one at the top says life expectancy. I can't tell what the other one says.
Years of schooling?
Oh yeah, education, how many years of schooling, things like that. And also looks at things like GDP. So basically, the Human Development Index, it looks at a lot besides just the trade and value in a country, but it still relates a lot to economics. So like I said, life expectancy. I think our life expectancy in the US is like 78. It's gone down a lot recently. Norway currently has the longest life expectancy, I believe, or highest. I think they have the highest Human Development Index. It looks at things like maternal health rates. So how likely is a pregnant woman to live? Does she have access, and her baby as well? Those are two different things. Does she get prenatal care? Is she going to have access to a hospital if things go badly? It also looks at education. So one of the things, you can go to the next slide. Yeah. So one of the things it looks at is not just how long is their education system, but how likely is it that boys and girls will both get to be in that education system, and sometimes that is only like 3 years. So we can come back to this later, and this looks like, what the heck, like I don't even know. But essentially down here is when they started measuring this in 1990. So they started collecting data. And a lot of these countries, so Ethiopia starts right here, for example. And like I said, we'll come back and look at that in a little bit. This is poverty. This is how you measure poverty. They have a really low GDP. They have low education rates. They have a low life expectancy. They probably have high child marriage. I think right now when I looked at it, if you are under 18, 40% of women in Ethiopia are married. That's pretty young. That's not like a whole far, many years off from where you guys are at right now. And it's even higher for like under 12. It's different. And that looks different all across the world, So your access to clean water, all those kinds of things. So one thing I want to point out though, is that it always seems like the world's ending, and everything's awful and bad, and we haven't done anything, and this is all bad stuff. But in this graphic, you can see that there's actually an incline, which means that, yes, not everybody's doing great, and not every country is the best to live in, and you certainly wouldn't want to be born in Syria or something like that. But overall, we have, as a world, improved the standard of living, and it's recognizable. And there's data to prove that. Okay, you can go to the next one. So we're gonna do a little bit of case study time. You can go one more. So the case study we're gonna talk about is Ethiopia. And I went to Ethiopia, I think the year one of you said you were born, in 2009. I was 9 years old, and my parents like debated even taking me with them, but I really wanted to go. And when we went was whenever I first met Felix and Fisher. So they were these cute little babies, and I was so excited to meet them. And all we knew was these little pictures that we had gotten online. And like, you guys know Fisher, he always has the biggest smile on his face. He's so fun. From the second that we saw Fisher, he just lit up. And it was like instantly after meeting him, I was like, oh yeah, this little kid right here is like for sure mine. And Felix was so sweet. And I remember just like the cuddliest, cute little baby. Oh, but being in Ethiopia was really eye-opening because I was seeing at that time kids my own age in orphanages. Do you know what I mean? Like, I was sitting here kind of thinking about it like, well, I don't really understand why that's not me, because there's nothing that I've controlled about my life or done to get here. This is just where I was born, you know? And it started like raising lots of questions in my mind of like what that looks like and why some people are born where they are and all those things. And then we ended up just kind of falling in love with Ethiopia. Some of the things I remember and that we still talk about is that, like, I feel like in the US we're very much so like, this is my personal space and my bubble, and I don't want people to pop my bubble. I like to keep my hands to myself. In Ethiopia, people have their arms around each other. They're so loving. One of the things that's really interesting is that it is one of the oldest civilizations in the world. It's 3,000 years old. Those exact borders were drawn later on, but essentially that area has been controlled by the same people for the same purpose for a really, 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 really long time. And Ethiopia is in the Horn of Africa. So you know the continent looks like this, and there's this little curly Q over here. So it's in the Horn of Africa. So, you know, it's actually pretty close to the Middle East, and it has access some places to its near coast, but it's actually landlocked after Eritrea. That's a whole other thing. But given that it's in the Horn of Africa, it's in this part of Africa called the Rift Valley. Does anybody else know what the Rift Valley is? Okay, think Lion King. So you've got this massive valley that runs through an entire continent. When I say you cannot picture how big it is, picture something big and then multiply that by 10. So like when I thought of big, I was like, Grand Canyon. I've never been. When I Google pictures online, it looks huge. This is so much bigger than that. There's valleys that just span miles and miles and miles. And on top of that, this is the entire continent. I think Ethiopia, if I remember correctly, is like 2 Texases, or maybe even more. It's huge. And one thing that's really interesting about it is all this kind of brown stuff, it's hard to tell, but that's mountains. It has a really, really, really high altitude. So this area right here is a valley that runs through, but this is all mountainous and this is mountainous. Addis Ababa, which is the capital, is somewhere up here, and it's like 8,000 feet, which is really high. And so because of that high altitude, it has things from, you know, really tall, like dry, desertous type, you know, mountain looking structures, all the way to tropical forest and jungles. So the entire country falls in tropical latitude. So it's actually pretty near the equator. So it's like decent weather year round. And if you think about high altitude, tropical weather, that's the perfect environment to grow coffee, which coffee originated in Ethiopia. Yeah. And there's also really diverse terrain because it's so big. So over here, it's mostly desert. You know, that would be the one area they'd kind of be at risk of getting invaded or something like that. It's not a huge deal because it's so hot to live there, not a lot of people do. And it's also one of the most rugged terrains in all of Africa. You can go to the next slide. You can try to click on this video. I'm not sure, it didn't work earlier, but it's okay if it doesn't work. Basically, this is just a really short video that talks about the geography itself of Ethiopia and how like strategically that plays into some things. So one of the things that's interesting is that, also this, like pretty much the Rift Valley runs all the way down here. But one of the interesting things about Ethiopia is that the Nile crosses through Ethiopia. So something that's been in the news in the past couple of years is Egypt and Ethiopia have been butting heads over water rights in this dam that they built because, crazy, the Nile is the only river in the world that flows north. So it doesn't start here in Alexandria up in Egypt and flow down. It starts way down here at Lake Victoria, I believe, and it actually flows up. Isn't that so crazy to think about? Yeah. And so water's so precious. And you read a lot about water, people not having access to water or building wells and things like that. So my family, after we adopted Felix and Fisher, we participated in raising money for a clean water project, which I believe had like 13 different water points and gave clean water to around 250,000 people in the village and the area that Felix and Fisher are from. Because water's really scarce. And one of the things about water is that, like I said before, a lot of times girls are the ones who have to go get water. So if you're going and getting water 3 to 4 times a day, you're definitely not in school and you're not getting an education. And so that continues to limit women's empowerment all over the world where women are getting water. So this is just a cool video. It's by RAIN, which is a really neat private intelligence company, and it kind of talks about the geography and some of the strategic stuff about Ethiopia. You can go to the next slide. So, like I said, culture-wise, Ethiopia is one of the oldest civilizations. One thing that's interesting about it is it was the second civilization to adopt Christianity for their predominant language. So actually certain parts of your Bible, you'll see Ethiopia being mentioned, or an Ethiopian woman or an Ethiopian man and things like that, which is pretty cool. And so Christianity, it has 80 different ethnic groups. So there's lots of different tribes and even older religions and things like that. But for thousands of years, predominantly, it's actually been a Christian country. And that dates back to King Solomon, and then there was a second kingdom that was established, I'm blanking on the name, that for thousands and thousands of years just had Christianity as the predominant religion. And Ethiopia has been invaded, but was actually never colonized. So the country that invaded Ethiopia was Italy, and that happened a really long time ago. It was the fascists that tried to invade it. And Portugal was really interested, but they could never actually get their hands on Ethiopia. But it has always been its own independent country. And going back to the UN Charter that we talked about earlier, it was one of the first independent countries, especially in Africa, who signed the UN Charter, which is really neat to think about. So it was one of the first nations to sign the UN Charter. This is an example of Ethiopian art. We have a lot of Ethiopian art in our home, and I think it's so great. And what I love about it is that in all of the art, the eyes are huge. And I think that's so fun. Like Felix and Fisher Felix does this thing a lot of times where, like if you say something to him and he's surprised, he goes, huh? Yeah. And his eyes are like this big. And I literally don't even know how he opens his eyes that big. And they both, and even when they smile, like their eyes are just like huge. This is how they've been drawing Ethiopians for thousands of years. They are known for these bright, beautiful eyes. And this is a basket that we have some at our house, but a lot of times that's what they eat out of. So there's tons of different styles of baskets, and African baskets are great. You can see West African examples, East African, all over, and they change pattern and color and what they're made out of, depending on where it's from. But this is pretty standard of what an Ethiopian basket would look like. You can go to the next one. This is injera. This is injera. It's this like bubbly, sour, kind of fermented flatbread. When I first tried it, I was like, oh my God, absolutely, this is not for me. But now I love it. There's a really great, if you guys ever get a chance to go, Ethiopian restaurant actually in St. Louis, and they have injera, and they have different types of meats and vegetables and all kinds of things. It's always really beautiful and colorful, and then they just grab a piece of injera and they pick it up and they eat it, and that's how they eat it. You can go to the next one. And then going back to coffee, so this is kind of what those traditional coffee ceremonies. If you ever get to go to Ethiopia, I highly recommend you go to one. So they roast the beans in front of you, and it's this whole thing. But this is kind of what a traditional Ethiopian coffee pot looks like. So it has a really tall neck, and they make it really hot. And then I think it's really funny, but they serve it in these. Do you guys like the coffee drinkers, like really, really sweet coffee or like black coffee? Okay, yeah, I'm like on that wave too. They serve it in these tiny teacups, and they put like half a cup of sugar in there and a little bit of coffee. So you're like drinking it, and it's like, oh my gosh, I have so much energy. And then they keep refilling your cup, and it's so great, and it's so awesome. And that's also kind of traditional Ethiopian wear. Like I said, there's 80 different groups there, so not everybody's gonna have the exact same traditional clothing, but that's one, that's like more common. This is another example, and also the women have this really cool dance that they do, and it's basically like they jump as high as they can. That's kind of neat. And you can go to the last slide. Okay, so that kind of concludes what we talked about. Let me see what time it is. Perfect. But if you have like a little curiosity or interest about any of the things that we talked about today, I just really, really want to encourage you to look into that more and dig deeper. There's tons of great podcasts that talk about human rights and things. There's tons of books. I have some that I recommended here. This one's called Why Nations Fail. Something really interesting that I learned from that book. And again, you know, all of these books have their pros and cons. It's not, you shouldn't agree with everything you read. Always think critically about what you're reading, especially the news. But this book, I studied it a lot in college, and it talked about how if a country has a mountain range that runs through the middle of it, it's more likely to have a civil war because it splits the country in two from a capital. The US, we have Colorado Rockies. It's really interesting. Evidence for Hope. This is a great book on human rights. It's actually a short read. All these other ones are pretty chunky, but this one's short. And it basically says that I know the world's not great. There's a lot of room that we have left for improvement, but what we've been doing is working. And there's evidence of hope that if we keep working, we can continue ending things and getting, you know, poverty, access to food, famine, hunger, stuff like that. Half the Sky and The Moment of Lift are great books that talk about socioeconomics, women's empowerment, women's issues around the world. And then The Education of an Idealist is actually a book about an American diplomat. She was the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power. She's so great. And she was an immigrant here. She's actually from Ireland. And it talks about how her different experiences in life led her to being this huge advocate and protector of human rights in all of the genocides that happened around the world. So the Bosnian genocide, the Rwandan genocide, and things like that. So yeah, there's some book recs that I have if you're interested in any of them. But now we have like a little bit of time for questions. If you guys have anything else you want to ask about, anything at all. Yeah.
What did you say your major was again?
So my major in college was Arabic and then International Studies. And my master's degree was in Global Policy Studies, so it's GPS, MGPS. And I specialized in security, law, and diplomacy at the University of Texas. Yeah.
Where did you say your internship was?
In New York City at the United Nations. So the UN has tons of different offices and arms. So there's UNICEF, there's UNDP, which is, anyway, I was in the UN Office of Counterterrorism, which is in the Secretariat of the United Nations. And then I was on the Victims of Terrorism Unit at the UN. Yeah.
When was the UN founded again?
1948 it was signed in 1948, the Universal Declarations of Human Rights. I think technically the UN was founded in 1945. So it was in June of 1945, is whenever they signed the UN Charter. So I think that's when it was technically like established. Yeah.
So your job is pretty unique. But
Yeah.
What's like an everyday? What do you do every day? Like basic, normal.
Like outside of what I do for work, or like in that job, what do I?
In your job?
In the job. Yeah. So I was just an intern. I'm trying to jump into my career right now. But what I will say that I kind of specialized in is writing. So I consider myself a writer. I worked really, really, really hard and still do at writing because it's one of the best and most important ways to communicate. And so when you think about security issues, it's about how well do I communicate this warning to you. So if we're on the verge of war or there's about to be an attack, I have to try and convey to you, the decision maker, the president, the policy maker, this warning. And if you're like, if I don't say it right and you're like, okay, we'll look into that next week, thanks, and you go on, then I could have just like prevented war with what I had to say. So one of the things I do a lot is writing. I do research. Intelligence is more so kind of how I think about it. So there's ongoing issues happening every day. And I'm not, I don't have access to like the hush-hush top secret intelligence, but there's open source intelligence, and that's really common. So open source intelligence is looking at the news, following a specific issue, a topic. So all of the research I did, for example, on like ISIS and women in terrorism and things like that, was using open source intelligence, so looking, researching, writing, and then I present a lot. So I'd brief on different issues, brief policymakers. I got to brief a senator on some issues, some counter-terrorist activity happening in Syria. We talk a lot. The UN is a lot of meetings. It's a lot of sitting down and getting people together. But I got to work closely with some ambassadors and delegates from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Spain. One of my colleagues is in Spain, and so she helped me write a project for Spain. So it's a lot of writing, and in the UN role, which is very diplomacy, it's a lot of meetings and hi, how are you? And we're going to follow up with you. The last thing I'll say is that I did have the chance to meet with some actual victims of terrorism when I was there. One of the girls that I met with, I met her on her 19th birthday. When she was 9, she had been sold into sexual servitude to 4 different ISIS fighters. And she survived and she escaped. And now she's trying to, at 19, be an advocate. She was a Yazidi, which is a small minority group that was in Iraq and in Syria. And she's trying to advocate for justice for her and her people. The Yazidis experienced genocide by ISIS. And so trying to do anything possible to hear her out and give her a platform so that she can speak and be able to talk more prominently and, kind of encourage the UN to take access, measures of justice and things like that to help her and help her people and make sure it's never forgotten and that it doesn't happen again. So some of those things also got to happen, which were really special.
So when you think about like high schoolers now, you're not that far away from high school, just 7, 8 years or so. Like, when you think about that for these guys, what is a piece of advice that you would give them? Because, not only do we try to get people in to talk about our topic that we're discussing, but also to showcase other careers, like how did you get there? And but like what piece of advice would you give these guys?
Yeah, so, the piece of advice that I would give you is the same piece of advice I've received from so many people that I really, really respect. And that is what your interest is, what your passion is, whether that's, you're a die-hard foodie and you love food and you want to be a chef or a cook or interior design. Or for me, it was like human rights and war, and I just had all these questions about how the world was going and stuff like that. Find time to always pursue that, because experiences that I did in high school and even before are the ones that got me the next internship or the next position. And I think as long as you're continuing to kind of cultivate that and feed that, I really don't think anyone goes to college saying, oh, this is exactly what I'm going to do when I graduate. Something like 60% of people don't even do a job related to what their degree is. But you're probably going to want to do something every single day that you're passionate about. So whatever that is now, if it's working with kids who have special needs, if it's teaching, if it's gardening, you know, whatever that interest looks like for you, find time now. Find people here that are doing something about that. Go learn from them, get a mentor. The best thing you can do for yourself is get a mentor who's doing that. I had so many who I still am in contact with and are still continuing to encourage me, because I need lots of daily encouragement. I don't know what I'm doing, I'm trying to figure it out, you know, and opportunities pop up. When you do what you love, you're gonna find yourself in the right place at the right time, and opportunities will open, and that leads to the next thing. So starting that now, whether that's trying to identify what that looks like, you know, sports, whatever, get involved. Find a person who's doing it, ask them a lot of questions about it. Start trying to do your own thing, even if it's really awkward. Maybe it's a podcast, maybe it's writing about it, maybe it's writing a paper or something to just start. Find your starting place, and then don't stop. And you just got to keep going, because it'll change. Your interests will continue to change. But as long as you have this thing going for you on the side outside of school, that's for sure what will set you apart and set you up for success for actually achieving those goals that you're setting. Yeah.
Do you guys have any other questions? This was excellent.
Yeah.
What advice would you give for someone who's interested in international studies or intercultural studies?
Yes. Okay. I think like the broader thing people would tell you is like, oh, go travel. Traveling is really hard to do. It's really expensive and things like that. But what I can say on the flip side that's more achievable and tangible, do you have like a certain area that you're interested in of the world? No? Not really? That's okay. Figure out what that is. So like I became really interested in, you know, loved all the work that my family was doing in Ethiopia, and I loved Africa. But then I just connected with the Middle East, and that is like this place that I love deeply. Start learning a language. Learning a language is it's the best skill that'll be the most marketable sense for you in any profession and job, and always give you an opportunity to like go wherever you want with that job. So you've got access if you live around here. SEMO has so many international students, and there's really great organizations that a lot of those international students go to, where you can just maybe start learning language, whether that's Duolingo, but talking to people about their experiences, talking to people about their culture. One thing I love to do is I have a cookbook of Arab recipes, and so I'm like slowly learning more through this cookbook, and you know, things like that. I think the more you familiarize yourself and you stop seeing it as like a them versus me, so start there, see what you can do with language, talk to people, learn about their culture, see what opportunities open up. And then travel when that door opens, whether that maybe is a study abroad or something like that, you know, if you go to school, and read, because you can travel when you read, you know? Yeah, but just surround yourself with people who don't, you know, have the same background as you and stuff like that. That's the best way you can do it. Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks for having me, guys. Oh, yeah. Let's see. So I think the first place I went abroad was Ethiopia. And then I've been to a country it's now called Eswatini. It used to be called Swaziland. It actually has the highest rate of AIDS in the entire world. And so I was able to do some AIDS relief work when I was there. I've been to Kenya. I love Kenya. It's so fun. It's so beautiful. I've been to Israel, and that was great. I went last year. Amsterdam, which is, you know, in the Netherlands. I went to the UK. I've been to Mexico. I don't know. But hopefully when I go back to the UN, I'll be able to travel a lot more broadly, which would be really neat. So yeah, just a couple random places. So anywho. Well, thanks guys. I wish you the best.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, definitely.